We thank you all for joining us here today for our class. Today's class is sponsored. We're going to thank our sponsor. It's sponsored by Lynn and Mordechai Ben Dat. We thank them for sponsoring the class.
And who are they sponsoring it in honor of?
Okay, so I do thank our sponsor. When you study an historical period, your outlook, your ideas, that which you consider significant will obviously highlight specific eras or years or periods. And if a person is interested in the history of elections in the free world, right, or the election of the world leader in the United States, when the United States would actually had a world leader. So obviously there are specific years that come to mind, right? So there's going to be a focus on the election of '64 and Barry Goldwater, and there's going to be discussion about Nixon in '68 and '72, and Carter in '80, and Reagan. Your interest will determine your priorities, your outlook, your philosophy, will tell you how to read an historical period. I mention here in Toronto often that when I say to people the year 1967, right? So what comes to mind? So most of us would be the Six-Day War. There are those who are going to say, yeah, it was the last time that the Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup. Right? There are those that are going to not going to mention who, but these are our outlook, our priorities, our understanding. When it comes to the historical period, which begins around the 5th or the 6th century before the Common Era, until the year 70 of the Common Era, so we as Jews call it Kufat Bait Sheni, the period of the Second Commonwealth. Now, we like calling it the period of the Second Temple, even though you're going to have some kind of archaeologist, historian that's going to walk in and claim, what do you mean the Second Temple? It was actually the 4th or the 5th Temple, because they restored it. Herod, in essence, rebuilt it. But for us, it is not just a structure and a date on a specific design, but rather it's an historical period. It's a period that has significance. And it's a very unique period. And it's a period that we need to have some clarity. You study Tanakh. You see from the first moment that the Almighty communicates with the people of Israel that we are given this wonderful land, but there are some serious warnings given to us how to behave in the land of Israel. And we are told if you improve, there's justice, there's kindness, there's chesed, there's emet, then you will merit to dwell in that land. If you blow it, if you are enticed and attracted to the pagan practices of others, the quick fix, the quick spiritual fix you get from Avodah Zarah, and as a result, ethics will be out the window, you're not going to last there long. Well, that's in the Torah. And then we read the story, it's in the Tanakh, the story, the king in the days of the kings, that you have a pagan nation, in some areas corrupt, in some cases a corrupt nation. Prophets warning them, from Isaiah to Yirmiya, I'm warning you that if you don't fix it, you're going to be exiled. And then they are exiled, they land up in Babylonia. Okay, there's nothing shocking there, because when you have a warning, and they indeed are enticed, and unfortunately give in to human weakness, that is going to be the result. There's no great difficulty in understanding it. But then, as the book closes, as Tanakh comes to an end, and we know that our ancestor, the Israelites, the Jews, are returning to the land of Israel, they enter into this period that is unclear to us. Why is it unclear? Well, it is a return to the land of Israel. We have a word for it. It is called Geulah. There's Galut, there's Geulah. Right? They were exiled in Egypt. They were freed from Egypt and made their way to the land of Israel. They're in the land of Israel. They misuse their quote-unquote redemption, and then they have a galut. So after they return from Babylonia, you would expect to label it with confidence that they merited to have Geulah. Was that a Geulah? There were some serious issues during the Second Temple period. A whole list of issues. So this is a complex area. It's an era that is unclear to us. We find them turning to the prophet Zechariah. And they asked the prophet Zechariah the following question, that during our 70 years in Babylonia, we observed 4 fast days, in addition to Yom Kippur. And these were fast days to commemorate the destruction, as a reminder that we have to improve to be worthy of returning to our ancestral land. So now comes the question, we have returned to the land of Israel. This is not a complete return. Many, if not most of the nations, stayed back in Babylonia. Even those who made their way, the 40,000 that made their way to the land of Israel, they were not always the high end of the people of Israel. There were some problematic individuals. Even the temple itself, it was lacking some serious and significant hardware that was necessary for the temple to function as the first one did. It's missing the Holy Ark, some obvious miracles that they became accustomed to during the first temple period, they're gone. So they're struggling here. What's the status of the second temple? So it's a unique period. It is a unique period. It is a period that the nation of Israel has to adjust to this question mark. Meaning, they are in the land of Israel, they do have a temple, but they still have to answer first to the Persian Empire, and then eventually to the Greeks, and then eventually to the Romans, until they destroy them. So, what exactly is their status during the Second Temple period? Right? They have to go ahead and deal with some significant challenges with the land itself, because, you know, in the early Zionists talked about the fact that we could return to Eretz Yisrael because it is a land without people, for a people without a land, something like that they phrased it. And you know, today it's a very controversial statement. What do you mean? The Palestinians were there, but that was the statement that was used. Well, the idea of returning to Eretz Yisrael, and you have to deal with some locals that made that land their home, was a problem that those who returned from Babylonia had to deal with. Because you know, the Assyrian king, Sennacherib, and so too King Nebuchadnezzar later on, they had a brilliant system that when they would uproot a nation, what they would do is that they would swap lands. They would take the Jews, the Israelites, right? They moved them to Babylonia, but then they took these group of people from what were known as the Kuthians, and they settled them in the land of Israel. They settled them there. And these Kuthians come to the land of Israel, and in the book of Kings, we are given a detailed description of them being attacked by lions. They're in panic mode. So they hire a priest of the Israelites to go ahead and educate them how do you satisfy the gods that deal with this land? And he taught them some basics of Judaism, and they accepted them. So they come to the land of Israel, but the problem is that these Kuthians accepted and they converted, quote unquote, to these values of Judaism, but they're not going to let go of their old minhagim. In other words, they still had some pagan practices. So it was a serious question. What was their status? They converted for problematic reasons, but they do believe in the God of Israel, but at the same time, they were still worshiping these forces that they brought with them. And this question mark about the conversion, the questionable conversion of these Kuthians, remained for hundreds of years. We find rabbis 400 years after the events occur, 500 years perhaps after the events occur, They are still struggling. What is their status? They act like Jews, they sound like Jews, they kugel, they cholent, right? They even have a sense of humor, but the reality is, they still have this avodah zarah. What is their status? This is a very serious problem. So here you come back to the land of Israel. You come to Eretz Yisrael. This is your home, and you have to deal with these complex questions. Okay. Now, another significant event that really identifies for us the Second Temple period is, of course, the Holiday of Hanukkah. It is the only holiday, as we know, it is the only day that is after the text of the Tanakh is complete. It is the only holiday when we are actually celebrating nowadays something that occurs during the Second Temple period. And this is around the year 167 before the Common Era, 200 and something years before the destruction, that we regain control. And it becomes a holiday when we identify, we relate to that period, we actually go ahead and light at home a vessel that really has its place in the temple. And then, when you analyze that portion, when you analyze the story of Hanukkah, you realize that the behavior of those specific individuals that provided for us these wonderful events are the behavior, their attitude, their label are the exact same labels that are used by some very destructive parties that brought about the destruction of the Second Temple. And what am I referring to? Zealots. Zealots, people who have passion. People who, see the unseen. They could be a major pain, right? They could be the biggest mishugam. They could be nuts, the people that see the unseen. But they inspire us like no one else, right? When someone comes and there's excitement, right? We've read stories of the Holocaust, of people who had the ability to give courage, strength, right? To go ahead and rebuild. From the most inspiring stories, and there are many of them. But, one that comes to mind is that you had this Rebbe of Bobov. He's a young man, lost everything. They had an empire there in Europe. And he comes to North America, and he has perhaps a dozen people that are still his Hasidim. And he comes to the New York area, and he decides to rebuild. And he was already envisioning, as they were driving him, through Borough Park, or 48th Street, or 43rd Street, or 13th, or 18th, and he's pointing to specific areas, and he says, that would be a good place for a Beis Medrash one day. Meaning, this is a person that naturally you would expect him to collapse, right? And there are many people that had this ability to see the unseen, inspire others, uplift of others. Those are amazing. These are zealots. And that's what we celebrate on Hanukkah. People that go ahead and say, you know what? You think that because we're being persecuted by the Greeks, it's the end of Judaism? It is the end of our way of life? You think that the temple is going to remain a pagan temple? Well, we could do it. Yes, we can. And we're going to go ahead and actually ignore the odds, ignore the numbers. If there's passion, if we do it for the right reason, we shall succeed. Zealots. They were zealots. But boy, did they bring a wonderful victory to the people of Israel. And these are the same, the nature of zealots. There's passion. Transferred to the year 66 through the year 70, when the Romans are controlling the land of Israel. When these zealots say, what do you mean give in to the Romans? We have our own identity. We have the right for self-determination, and therefore, we don't care what they say. We're going to fight them, right? We have the ability. So what if they have weapons that are far more sophisticated and numbers and they outnumber us by tens of thousands? Who cares? We have passion. We can do it. That behavior actually brought about the destruction of the Second Temple. It's interesting that when you read Talmudic literature, so the personality we focus on when we talk about Tisha B'Av and the destruction is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. If you're an historian, you study the works of Josephus. There are variations between, the outlook is different. In other words, Josephus thinks this is in exile and this is our new reality and we are a Jew. We have to adjust to the idea that we are a Jew, that we have an identity without a homeland and forget about a return, no reference. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, even after the destruction, is the one to say, you know what? We're going to go ahead and create an identity even without a temple, but everything we'll do will always have our mind and our eyes on a return. And often you hear him saying, Mehera yibaneh hamikdash. So there are differences between them. In one area, in one field where they do agree, is that the big problem the Jews had to deal with were the zealots. People that were not rational, people that were inspired, right? People that were indeed seeing that which is really unseen. But they guide us to a churban, to a destruction. Now, the reason we're talking about the Second Temple period, is because Nachmanides tells us that the Chumash, specifically Bereshi, is a book that is establishing a pattern. And if it is establishing a pattern for us, number one, you could find the roots of a specific period in this book, in the Chumash Bereshi. And number two, at times you're going to be getting some guidance. By reading the text, it will guide you how to deal with the challenges that the Jewish nation is going to face in the future. And Parashat Vayishlach, there are close to 10, and perhaps even more, occurrences that relate specifically to the Second Temple period. And therefore, if we understand the Second Temple period, and understand the Parsha, we suddenly sense that the two come together. Now, number one, we as Jews believe that the land of Israel belongs to the people of Israel. Period. There's nothing to negotiate regarding that fact. Now, at the same time, we recognize that the land of Israel is a spiritual land. Right? It's a meaningful land. And it's not an irrational statement. Because if you look at the news, right, and you look at the attention the world gives to this tiny land, and you could have the world collapsing, and of course everyone's going to blame, this little land. I mean, there are people out there right now, the Jimmy Carters in the world, and you had who was the foreign minister of Sweden, who says straight out that of course there's passion and the Arabs are angry, and of course in Paris they they destroyed the city in essence because they're angry for what the Jews are doing, right? So there's something irrational there, but suddenly we recognize if such absurdity exists, it must be, and if the whole world is always eyeing this land, this tiny country, it is always being eyed. When there could be on a daily basis thousands killed anywhere, right? In Nigeria and Syria, a little bit in Israel, so there's something we have to walk away with. We shouldn't just get upset. We do get upset. But we have to realize that there's a reason for it. There's something unique about this land. There's something supernatural. And then you start studying about the Jewish people. And there are many, by the way, many righteous Gentiles that recognize that there's something unique about the Jews. Right? I mean, former Prime Minister Harper's father told him, right? You have to be, good to the Jews, right? There are righteous people that sense there's something supernatural. So the idea of Jews belonging in Israel is rational. We're not normal for many reasons, right? Jews are different. They're supernatural. The land of Israel is supernatural. A wonderful shidduch. Now, the question is, what happens when the Jewish people are not on the right spiritual level? Right? Let's say we're not on the right spiritual level. We're not fulfilling our responsibility to the fullest. One would argue, that perhaps we don't merit Eretz Yisrael. Perhaps. Meaning, it's a land where we are supposed to behave in a specific way, right? It's a land that brings us close to God. When you are an individual or as a nation, close to the Creator and fulfilling those requirements, then you deserve the land. Perhaps, if we are not where we should be, perhaps we don't deserve it. Well, in this week's Parsha, Yaakov Avinu does something very interesting. He is returning home, and he starts his return by warning his brother, I'm coming. Was it necessary? There's some rabbinic sources that say that it is like a person who's afraid of a dog. So what they do is they go ahead and they pull the ear of a dog. Not a wise thing to do, right? Why do you, Yaakov Avinu, wonders the Midrash, why do you have to agitate this out? Just go in. It's your homeland. You've been promised by God that it's your homeland. Why do you have to interact with him at all? Well, commentators explain, my father would explain, that the reality is that Yaakov Avinu senses, right? There's a very spiritual being, that there will be a time that the people of Israel are going to want to return to this land when they are not on the right spiritual level, when they are lacking. They're not where they should be. If Israel would only be given to us based on the fact that God said the righteous children of Israel deserve this land, we will not be granted ever an entry when we're not on the right level. Here, what we are establishing is that even when we are not where we should be, when we are granted permission by the nations of the world, Eretz Yisrael is ours. Even if we're not on the right level. This is what Yaakov Avinu does. And guess what? Second Temple period. They return to Israel. You know who is called the Messiah of that period? The one that we give him credit for us being able to return to Eretz Yisrael? Koresh. Cyrus. Meaning, the Jewish people are not where they should be. But nevertheless, we're given a homeland. Eretz Yisrael is given to us because when the nations of... So we have two ways of achieving a return to Israel. Option number one, right? Plan A would be when we are on the right spiritual level. If we are not there, plan B is when the nations grant us permission. Who establishes this pattern? Yaakov Avinu. And it's very possible that he could have relied on plan A, but recognizes, sensing that there will be a time when they will not have the ability to achieve it, he establishes a plan B. Permission from Esav, permission from Cyrus. Cyrus is the one that grants us permission to return. And, obviously, November of 1947. Right? Or you could say the Balfour Declaration, but clearly, November 1947. What did we have? We were granted permission to return. It's interesting to note that we've discussed in the past, there's a statement in the Talmud that the people of Israel took an oath. We took an oath that we're not going to make our way to the land of Israel, right, without permission. We're not going to, quote unquote, climb the wall. We're going to be waiting until the gates open for us. And as a result of that statement, there were those, as early Zionism, Holiday of Hanukkah, are developing towards the end of the 19th century, there were those who believed that you cannot join a nationalistic movement because it is as if you are making your way to Eretz Yisrael by force. That's not appropriate. You need to get permission from the nations. You have to have the nations of the world opening the doors for you. There was such a philosophy, and there are those, by the way, that still live by that philosophy, known as Satmar. I don't know if any of you here have followed the philosophy of Satmar or not, and they, I'm sure they do a lot of nice things. They do chesed to one another within Satmar. But that was the Satmar philosophy. That was their philosophy. And that remains their philosophy, that we reject it because we're not granted permission from the nations. So there was a tremendous thinker, a Meir Simcha from Dvinsk, known as the Or Sameach, and he writes in 1920 that now that the nations in San Remo granted Eretz Yisrael, right, and affirmed the Balfour Declaration of 1917, this concern for this quote-unquote oath has vanished. Meaning, we were given permission, as Yaakov Avinu was given permission, as Cyrus gave permission. So what we are seeing here is that even the beginning of this week's portion starts off with establishing the pattern for the Second Temple period. So therefore, what I would like to do is go through some of them. It's interesting to note that when Yaakov Avinu hears that there is an attack on page 172, and he does something very interesting, that he divides the people with him into two camps. What symphony is that?
I have no idea. Oh, the diamonds are here. The diamonds are here. He doesn't have a copy.
I was waiting for it.
It's good. Now, Yaakov Avinu divides into two camps. Im yavo Esav el machaneh achat mikau, and he declares that if Esav comes and he strikes one camp, the other one will survive. Nachmanides notes that throughout Jewish history, the Jews in exile were always in different locations. We had Jews in Babylonia, we had Jews in Israel, we had Jews in Spain, Jews in Germany. Right? We never placed all our eggs in one basket. And this occurs, and it starts off during the Second Temple period. You have a strong presence in Eretz Yisrael, but even a stronger, perhaps, at least in the beginning, in Babylonia. So that's reference to it. Now, the list continues, and obviously we're going to move forward to page 180. A very unfortunate event with Dinah, that she's taken by Shechem. The ones to react are obviously the zealots here, meaning Shimon veLevi, meaning she's taken. The family enters into negotiations. The negotiations were that if you circumcise, perhaps then we could have a pact with you and you could take our daughters. Their intention was two ways to view it. Perhaps they were planning, it seemed at least, that the plan was to weaken them physically and they could just take Dinah home. Perhaps some were of the opinion that before the Torah was given, mitzvot had a spiritual impact that would improve the individual. And perhaps if they were circumcised, they would be inspired, grow spiritually, and sense that the taking of Dinah was inappropriate and they would return her. That's perhaps what the plan was. But on page 184, Shimon and Levi have their own understanding of the best way to deal with it. And they pick up their sword on page 184, verse 25. And they come to the city. They kill every single male. They wipe the city off the map. Yaakov is extremely upset. And he claims that this is going to put me in a very a dangerous situation. I am few numbers, and the inhabitants of the land can destroy us. They say, listen, we cannot allow our sister to be treated like an harlot. Period. Meaning, don't give us these rational, dangerous situations. The numbers are against us. If it is something that's wrong, we're going to do it. These realities that you present are not ones we take into consideration. They are the Kanaim. So obviously, if this is something that is talking about Second Temple period, you know and we know very well that the thread, Maimonides tells us that the period leading to the Hanukkah miracle. The Hanukkah miracle was the fact that the Greeks controlled them and they took their daughters. Jews were not able to live as Jews, but they even took them. Pashtu yedehem bibnotehem. This is what Maimonides tells us regarding that period. That's what occurs in this week's parsha. And this salvation comes about due to the zealots, as we see in this week's portion, that the salvation comes about due to two individuals that facts are not going to have an impact on their decision. And just as the Yehuda Maccabi, the Hashmonaim, the numbers, we're not concerned about numbers. If we're concerned for preserving our identity, our Judaism, numbers are going to be ignored. So there's another similarity here. But I think a detail, on page 35, we have really the most significant. So page 186, chapter 35. Vayomer Elokim El Yaakov. So the Almighty turns to Yaakov, and he says to him, Kum ale Betel v'shev sham. You must go to, you with me? Ve'aseh sham mizbeach, make an altar to thank me. Next verse, verse 2. So Yaakov turns to his children and he says to them, in line 2, Hasiru, you should go ahead and remove. Et Elohei hanechar, you should go ahead and get rid of these alien gods, asher betochachem, meaning get rid of your avodah zaros. And you ask yourself a question. Remember what Rachel did at the end of last week's portion? Mm-hmm. What was she trying to do? She took away these teraphim from her father with the intention that he shouldn't continue these pagan practices. So obviously there was an awareness in that family that Avodah Zarah is something that is to be avoided. So here he has to turn to his children and say, get rid of Elohei HaNechar. What is he talking about? Right? What is it referring to? So obviously there are some items they picked up when they looted Shechem. They looted Shechem. But you could ask yourself, would they really take pagan images with them? Is that what they would loot the city for? I mean, you can understand if there's gold or silver, electronics, but when it comes to Elohei Nechar, why would they take it? So then Nachmanides explains that if you have, for example, an item that was used in a pagan temple, but a Gentile nullifies it, meaning the Gentile sees no value in it anymore. He doesn't see it as something that has a purpose. It no longer is considered Avodah Zarah, and it becomes an item that you're allowed to use. However, if you want to enter into a spiritual experience, even such an item should be avoided. So it seems to be something that's not a requirement, but it's part of their spiritual growth. So what do? So that is what they are being told to remove. They begin this process of purification, and in verse 4, we are told that he takes these possessions, these questionable possessions, and it's built, and it's buried under the Elah, type of tree, next to Shechem, and they fulfill what they were told to do. Now, if you look carefully at Rashi, the Rashi on top, from rabbinic sources, Kum Aleh, in other words, Yaakov just suffers terribly. Right? Daughter violated what it did to the family, the pain to Dinah, the pain to the family members. And immediately following that, the beginning of this chapter, we are told, make your way, Yaakov, make your way to Bethel. What's the relationship between their suffering, the agony they went through, and the journey they are told to take? So Rashi tells us, you see the words? Lefi she'echarta baderech. Therefore, ne'enashta, you did not make your way, so therefore you got punished. Harsh words, meaning there was some enthusiasm missing there. Your return was not complete. And it's interesting to note that in the 3rd century, there's a rabbi in Israel by the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. They call him Resh Lakish. That was his name. And Resh Lakish, when he would meet a Babylonian Jew, he would get very agitated. And he would say, I don't like the Babylonians. What's your problem with the Babylonians, Resh Lakish? So he notes that Babylonians, in the days of Ezra, they did not return. They did not make their way to Eretz Yisrael. If they, and Resh Lakish would argue that if they would have joined Ezra on his journey to Eretz Yisrael, the redemption would have been complete. Meaning the Second Temple period is a semi-redemption, not a complete one, obviously. Resh Lakish blames Babylonian Jews for staying back. The Jews in Chutz La'aretz. Whenever I read this, I feel very guilty. The Jews who are not in Israel, who say it's wonderful there's a Jewish state, it's wonderful that we have a homeland, but I can't leave right now. I'm busy. I'm working. The language. I'm gonna have to adjust to the different currency, whatever it is. The Kupat Cholim instead of I'm not sure which one is better. So that's what Resh Lakish was addressing. You people in Babylonia, you are to blame. Your lack of enthusiasm for a return. Perhaps a reference for it right now. But now, what is interesting to note, I mentioned to you that during the Second Temple period, they struggled with questionable conversions of the Kuthians. The rabbis tell us that for many centuries they weren't sure if their conversions were indeed for the sake of heaven, until at one point they discovered that there was, in the words of the rabbi, a dmut yonah, an image of a dove that was found on a mountain, which the Kuthians worshipped. next to Shechem. There is a mountain called Mountain of Grizim. On the mountain of Grizim there was a temple. In that temple there was this image of a dove. The rabbis discovered that these Kuthians worshipped this image of a dove, and as a result it became clear to them that these people, these Kuthians, never really converted for the sake of heaven. It was a questionable conversion. Fine, this is a rabbinic statement. And the Midrash tells us that this dove, the Kuthians found, under this Elah, under this tree. It was an image that originated in Shechem. And Shechem, by the way, what happened in Shechem? They also went through a conversion. They circumcised. Was there circumcision? Was there commitment to join Jewish practice and philosophy for the sake of heaven? Obviously not. It was for the sake of marriage. But what the rabbis are doing is that they are linking the behavior that is occurring in Shechem with the events of the Second Temple. Again, a parallel between the two, which makes it very, very interesting. If you look forward on page 186, we are told that, and this is a very difficult verse because it seems to be insignificant, verse 8 on page 186, we are told, Vatamat Devorah, that Devorah dies, who was the wet nurse of Rivka, Vatikaber, and she was buried next to this alon, and it was called the alon of Bachut, the alon of crying. So commentators have great difficulty in understanding the significance of the passing of this woman. So Rashi shares with us that actually the person who died here, the woman who died here, was actually Rivka. But the text tried to conceal it because at that time, Esav was a well-known problematic individual. And the text tries to conceal her passing because it was a shame for her that there was such an individual that was a child of hers. Nevertheless, they want to make reference to it, so it mentions the wet nurse. But if you see this whole chapter, if you see this whole section and this parasha as referring to a period when the speech of God comes to an end, like what happens during Second Temple period? What's the most significant difference between First Temple period and Second Temple period? The fact that they do not have prophecy. The dibur, the words of God, cease. There was as if a death of the word of God. Vatamat devorah, the dibur. So there's a reference to the speech of God that comes to an end because, again, we're looking at this portion as establishing a pattern for the Second Temple period. One other thing, it's interesting that when they are building the Second Temple, there's great excitement. In the book of Ezra, we are told that the young people were full of enthusiasm and excitement that finally there's a return. But we are told that at the same time that the youngsters were happy, the elders were crying because they remembered the First Temple and they recognized that this structure does not match anything compared to what they had in the past. So as they are building, as the dibur dies, there was ha'am bochim. So this is referred to with the bachut as well. Whenever when you look at what's occurring now to the Jewish people, it's always important, tremendous concern we have now for what's happening in Israel. When you see a problem, right, and you do not have, no one has really answers to it, we get very concerned, agitated. It's very difficult times without a doubt. It is always important to step back and look at the big picture historically. In other words, clearly something very significant has been occurring over the past 120 years. When 120 years ago, the percentage of Jews that live in Israel was less than 1%, and now it's the largest Jewish community. Right? So something incredible occurred. Lots of pain and agony to reach that point, and it continues. But we have to look at things historically. Now, we ask ourselves the question, what is this? In other words, what is this entity? We are believers that there's going to be a future redemption. We are believers that the Jewish people have a mission to inspire humanity. Right? We believe that the concept of a Jewish temple is not for us to have this home, this hub, to have this spiritual location for ourselves, but rather to have an impact on the world. And just as we were told that we are supposed to be a nation of priests, we can achieve that mission with a temple one day. This is fundamental for us Jews, that we believe in this concept that is labeled by many Tikkun Olam, but we are believers that the Tikkun Olam is not going to be based on what Western philosophy dictates, but there's a concept of Malchut Shakai, in other words, that we want to go ahead and inspire the world. That's what we believe. So we believe in this future era called Geula. We also recognize that there's something, a painful thing called Galut. Exile when the Jews are not where they should be, not physically, not spiritually. Now comes the question, where are we now? What is going on now? No one can tell me that we have achieved a complete redemption. But no one can tell me that we are in a complete exile. So what is this period? And it's interesting that I always feel that the Second Temple period is a time that could give us a little bit of an understanding how to deal with what's occurring now. They had many, many problems then. They had problems with converts. They had problems with security. They had international issues with superpowers like with the Greeks and eventually the Romans. They had their issues, but nevertheless, we celebrate something called Hanukkah. And when we celebrate Hanukkah, we celebrate the fact that Jews regained control for a 200-year period of their homeland. And obviously what we are being told is that even though there are problems, it is something we should be thankful for. It is something to appreciate. And if then it was something to celebrate, and we've been celebrating Hanukkah for 2,000 years, so obviously we should be appreciative of what we have now. Now, appreciation in Judaism is not that you sit back with a nice cigar and a glass of scotch and say, I appreciate what's happening. Appreciation is always a call to action and to utilize what we have. And some commentators note that when the Jewish people are given a gift, the gift is to be utilized. And a return to Israel, the return to Israel, the Second Temple period, was for the Jews to enter the land of Israel. And you know, sometimes your kids, not you, they have these computer games and Xbox, what else are they called? These are games that are electronic, that they have these buttons, and they spend hours a day. Right? And that's how they educate themselves, by how to move a joystick, and hopefully they become a pilot and bomb ISIS with a joystick. But so in those games, not that I play it, but I've been told that you have like these bonus periods. In other words, that if you get some kind of gold chip in one field, everything you do, the same exact thing you were doing beforehand, by shooting some enemy, every enemy you shoot is not 1 point, but 6 points. Okay, that's how these games work. You can ask your grandchildren if you don't believe me. Now, with that, it's Eretz Yisrael. Any good deed done in Eretz Yisrael has a bonus point. Is far more valuable. The same mitzvah you do, right? You go ahead and you observe a Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael, it is more valuable. Commentators note, this is something that Nachmanides tells us in the beginning of last week's portion. Prayer is effective, something we believe in. It's a relationship to God. But there are locations where prayers are far more valuable. Obviously, Eretz Yisrael. And that's why, to tell us, the Second Temple period was a time for the Jewish people to maximize their spiritual existence. They were there because if they do things right in Israel, perhaps they can upgrade whatever they had into a final state of redemption. And this is how we should view it, of what's happening now. We have tremendous potential. The worst thing we do often is read the news, because the news is going to focus on the negative things that are occurring in Israel. When you visit Israel, you go ahead and you realize that there's tons of good, acts of kindness every single day. And, you know, when people ask, you're going to Israel, what are you going to be doing there? Right? So some people say, well, there's scuba diving, and there's, in the Jordan River, you could do boating, kayaking, right? A lot of good things. I think you could do it in West Virginia, too, in some of it. And you could do some of it in Florida. But there's one thing that you can't do anywhere else, and that is for the spiritual gift. Now, the food is also good there, there's no question, and probably better. The wine's there, They are much better now than any you could argue, but my opinion is that the Israeli wines are the best in the world. And there's no question, those are wonderful things to do when you make a bracha and you're thankful to the Creator. But to view Israel as a location where prayers are more valuable, if you're planning a trip in the near future, keep that on your to-do list. In other words, this is a place where you could actually utilize the gift, and it is something that occurred during Second Temple period. We did not achieve. Mission was not accomplished, but I do believe that the return now, and perhaps what we could get our inspiration during times of difficulty, is that the many good things being done every single day in Eretz Yisrael are indeed going to be those things that will save us and bring us to the state we belong in. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you in Bezrat Hashem next week.